Today's video is very much not about how to grow leafy greens in the summer, unless you would like to end up with a lot of beauties like this plant right here. Probably not, right? Nope, today's video is all about which leafy greens will give you a harvest, even if you abuse them and even if your climate currently looks a little bit like the surface of the sun. See, all of our leafy greens last year turned into something looking a little bit like this after a pretty good start. So this year we decided, hey, we're gonna run an experiment with 15 or so of our favorite leafy greens to see which of the ones that we like to grow in those cooler shoulder seasons could stand up to the heat in an area where temperatures start to spike into the hundreds, starting by early June and stay pretty darn hot until October or so. This video is for you if you, like us, struggle with bolting and wilting and bitter leafy greens in those hot summer months and you just want a couple varieties that you're confident are gonna stand up to those higher temperatures. I'm pretty excited to share what we found and what we learned, so let's get into it. Just to kill any suspense, maybe you're in a hurry, there were really only 2 varieties that held up well to the heat out of all 15 that we planted this year. First off, this Chijimisai that we picked up from Baker Creek or rareseeds.com, and this Frise Endive, stuff right here, get a bigger group of it so you can see it better. This stuff right here that we picked up from migardener.com. That said, I hope you'll stick around. We did learn a lot, and there were a few other varieties that were kind of runners-up that I think you might find interesting as well. Now, the experiment itself was pretty simple. We started by making a list of our 15 favorite leafy greens to eat. Not a list of the hardiest leafy greens or greens that are purported to be heat tolerant, just our 15 favorite to eat. See, I think one challenge for gardeners in the US, or at least those of us either in a hot southern climate or a western climate, is that a lot of seed packet descriptions are based on either Midwestern or more Eastern US climates and can be a little bit challenging to interpret for those of us in very different climates, or specifically those of us in much hotter climates. So in my experience, a lot of heat tolerant varieties really need to be verified as viable in those super hot climates. So rather than trying to kind of guess at what was going to work or find some list of heat tolerant greens, we thought, hey, we'll just throw the kitchen sink at it. We've got a lot of leafy greens we know we like to grow. We're gonna just see what works here in the summer. So I normally transplant just about all of my plants, including our leafy greens, but for this experiment, I went ahead and sowed all of the seeds at the same time directly into the ground, both at the front of our summer nightshade garden as well as at the back. Keep in mind that if you are growing summer leafy greens, almost all of them have a pretty low maximum germination temperature. They germinate best under 75 degrees, and they won't really germinate at all over 85 degrees. So when I clear out our existing rows that were created for this experiment and replace them with the winners from the experiment, I'm gonna have to start those seeds indoors, grow them a little bit, harden them off, and then transplant them when they're a little bit larger rather than direct sowing. In terms of soil for the experiment, we barely amended it at all. A little bit of compost and steer manure scratched in. No concentrated fertilizers were used at all. Looking back, I kind of wish that I'd set up those beds a little bit nicer, set up the plants a little bit more for success, but at the time I just really wanted to focus on creating these tough conditions and just kind of seeing which ones were going to thrive. Again, this is very much not a video on best practices for growing summer greens. This is a video on what is going to thrive in bad practices. So as I mentioned, we did 2 different locations. The location at the front of our summer nightshade garden receives about 9 hours of very warm, very direct sunlight. It's probably the most sunlight of anywhere in our entire property. And then at the back of the garden, that area receives about 2/3 as much, maybe 6 hours or so, but a lot of that light is actually dappled through the taller tomatoes that we have growing in front of it. So very different conditions. Interestingly, our results were pretty similar, and the winners of the overall experiment actually did better in the full sun location than they did in the partial sun location, which I was pretty surprised by. We also didn't erect any shade cloth whatsoever. Again, probably a little bit stupid, but at least it does tell us which of these varieties are going to stand up with basically no babying whatsoever. So same story on watering, which was pretty minimal using automated drip emitters, tightened down to a really low flow. We're not Phoenix hot, we're not Las Vegas hot, but it is a hot, dry climate with no precipitation whatsoever during the summer. Okay, the first thing that we found was that it didn't take long at all for the vast majority of these plants to just bolt and lose all of their flavor, starting with the mustard greens and the cabbages, our hokusai, our Tokyo Bacana mustard, our Mizuna. It all went really fast during that first heat wave of the season as temperatures kind of slowly reached into the high 90s and then spiked up to about 105 Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. So right off the bat, can take most of the greens that we tried off the list. And honestly, the endive here was just about the only plant that never bolted at all. It has still not bolted. I'm kind of amazed by it. Really cool stuff. This shungiku, also known as chrysanthemum greens, also took a really long time to bolt. Basically lasted until the third heat wave of the season. The problem was that it never really thrived, never really grew large enough or healthy enough to really get much of a harvest off it at all. It's a very interesting plant though. Hard to describe. Almost succulent-like, very moist, has a really cool texture, a lot of snap to it. I like growing it, I like eating it, but yeah, it doesn't quite make the list just because it did end up bolting. The nice thing though is that when it does bolt, it has the most beautiful flowers you can imagine. Really, really pretty. Quick side note, it's not surprising to see a lot of these plants never grew all of that large. Lettuce and most of the other leafy greens in this category that we're looking at, they don't really grow, they don't put on that much vegetation once temperatures in the soil temperature rises into those mid 80s or so, depending on the variety and depending on the plant. So for us, that was pretty long stretches, pretty early on in the plant's life cycle. If you are growing in a hot area like this, you may want to consider strategies for keeping that soil temperature a little bit low, lots of watering, potentially watering at night, shade cloth, etc. Or my favorite strategy, which is to intercrop them with the taller plants like the tomatoes and the peppers and the eggplants. That seems to work pretty well here. Our second winner, this Chijimisai, is a hybrid of the Japanese greens Komatsuna and Tatsoi. And like the endive, I really thought that it wasn't going to bolt at all this season. It was doing really well, but it did finally succumb to bolting, or about half the plants succumbed to bolting during our third heat wave of the season as temperatures again got over 100 degrees, and that was in late June. But before it got there, it grew pretty well and we got plenty of harvest off of it, so I'm considering it a clear winner. Now, the wild thing, to me at least, is that it really retained its flavor super well. Both the plants that bolted and the plants that didn't bolt. It was just absolutely delicious. And for what it's worth, Baker Creek does tout the Chijimisai as a heat-tolerant green and a cold-tolerant green that can potentially be grown year-round depending on your climate. So I guess these results are not unique to our little experiment here. Our first runner-up is this big, beautiful plant right here. I actually think this was the single most heat-tolerant plant we grew, technically, but there were two really big problems with it. The first off is that I did something kind of stupid and I forgot to label it, and I'm only about 90% sure that this is a variety of slow bolt broadleaf arugula, but I'm not 100% sure. And more importantly, the leaves are so incredibly bitter. They're really just not edible. Even these young new leaves that you would kind of assume are gonna be pretty nice are so bitter. I really can't eat them. I can't put it in a smoothie. I can't put it in a salad. It makes it kind of a useless plant for me. So unfortunately, we're just considering it a runner-up, at least in our climate. So our second runner-up is this red Vein Sorrel. And unfortunately, these leaves got kind of old and mangled and you can't quite tell how beautiful they are when they're in their prime, but it has such this unique, lush, vibrant, saturated color. I consider it an edible ornamental when it's in its prime. This plant and the red Mizuna definitely get the most compliments when they're growing amongst our other leafy greens in those cooler shoulder seasons. It's just really a pretty plant, very hardy. Unfortunately, it never quite thrived to the point where I would consider it as giving us a significant harvest in those summer months. So I kind of put it in that same category as the Chrysanthemum Greens, where it's pretty, it's nice to look at, it's pretty hardy in summer, but it just doesn't give you enough to be worth it, or at least it didn't in our experience. Switching gears here a little bit, on the opposite side of this, my biggest disappointment of the year was this Mizuna. Mizuna is one of my absolute favorite plants to grow, like one of my top 5 favorite plants. I'm always recommending it to others. I really don't think it gets enough credit or enough attention in those salad gardens. It's super delicious, super beautiful, really nice and peppery, super hardy, but apparently it just doesn't grow that well in really hot conditions. It was actually, I think, the first plant to bolt, and unfortunately with Mizuna, once it bolts, it's game over. On the flavor side, our 2 clear winners really both impressed me a lot. So starting with the Chijimisai, it's just packed with this rich, pleasantly earthy, almost spinach-like flavor. Texture is super smooth, no unpleasant bitterness whatsoever, despite the fact that it's been out in the super hot sun for a long time. Makes a great salad base, nice crunch to it. Honestly, if anything, I feel like I'm kind of underselling the taste of this plant. It is definitely one of my favorites to grow from a flavor perspective, regardless of its heat tolerance. And then you've got the Frise Endive, which has just this really cool sort of spiky, crunchy texture. It definitely has a slight bitterness to it, and endive should have a slight bitterness to it, but it's pretty mild. I don't get a whole lot of that. This is with terrible soil, too little water, too much sun, old plants, not enough nutrition, and it's still pretty mild. I would say my only complaint about this endive is that it doesn't have a super strong flavor. It's pretty mild. It just has that really, really nice texture that pairs well with the Chijimisai. On the planting and growing side, both of these grow really well. They're both really nice cut and come again crops, which I really prioritize. I like to be able to go out there, just get a little bit, throw it in a smoothie, throw it in a side salad, and then come again in a couple days. I will say that the Frise Endive, it is one of the very, very few edible plants I consider out there that really truly grows kind of like a weed. So a little anecdote, I was clearing out a space that we were growing this stuff in the fall, and I was replacing it with our pumpkin garden for the summer. And I guess I didn't quite get the stems, I didn't quite get the roots, and it came right back. I literally thought I'd killed it all off. And this little leafy green was still growing a couple weeks later. It's super hardy. You can grow it super densely. I don't know, it just is one of the easiest greens to grow in my experience. So if you want something that is basically just plant it and leave it, this might be a good pick for you. At the end of the day, if you are frustrated with your leafy greens going sort of wilty or bolting or starting to taste bitter and unpleasant in the summer heat, I can definitely recommend both the Chijimisai and the Frise Endive based on our direct experience this year in a very hot climate, as well as in direct comparison to quite a few other options. If I had to choose just one as a recommendation, I would probably go with the Frise Endive, not based so much on taste, but just how easy it is to grow. If you really just want a quick win in those summer months, man, this thing you can pack it in there, you can grow it densely. It doesn't seem to have very significant pest pressure. It doesn't seem to need all that much water. It never seems to bolt. It holds up to the sun really well. It's a little bit bitter, but it doesn't go unpleasant, certainly. It's just a really, really easy plant to grow. As always, your results may vary depending on your climate and your soil conditions. It is very hot here, it is very dry here, and we grow primarily into this native clay soil that has really high water retention. And so all of those factors really play into the end result of our little experiment here. Hey, do you have any recommendations for leafy greens that can stand up to the heat and major neglect? I would love to hear your favorites in the comments. And as always, happy gardening, y'all, and I will see you on the next one.